بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وصلى الله تعالى وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. أما بعد, I'm assuming sound is fine, inshallah. So today we will continue as usual. We're nearing the last 10 pages of the book. MashaAllah. So here we're on page 100 and, just in case, I haven't done that in a while, but page 172 on my Arabic copy. 170 rather on my copy, and there's pretty much nothing left of the translated one because where is it? I don't seem to have it here. There you go. So on the Shakir's translation, basically from quite a few pages back, he's decided that Imam Muhasibi is wrapping up and is repeating himself because he's reiterating certain things, and therefore he no longer provides any commentary, just translates it. So on his version from page 213 to page 224 is just translation, no commentary whatsoever. So, and we're on about page 219. So in his copy, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pages. So we're almost concluded. May Allah accept, inshallah. So Muhasibi says here, he says, وَعْلَمْ رَحِمَكَ اللَّهُ أَنَّ الصِّدْقَ وَالْإِخْلَاصَ أَصْلُ كُلِّ حَالٍ فمن الصدق يتشعب الصبر والقناعة والزهد والرضا والأنس وعن الإخلاص يتشعب اليقين والخوف والمحبة والإجلال والحياء والتعظيم ولكل مؤمن في هذه المقامات موطن يعرف به حاله فيقال له خائف وفيه الرجاء وراج وفيه الخوف وصابر وفيه الرضا ومحب وفيه الحياء وقوة كل حال وضعفه بحسب إيمان العبد ومعرفته ولكل أصل من هذه الأحوال 3 علامات يعرف بها الحال. فالصدق في 3 أشياء لا تتم إلا به: صدق القلب بالإيمان تحقيقا، وصدق النية في الأعمال، وصدق اللفظ في الكلام. والصبر في 3 أشياء لا تتم إلا به: الصبر عن محارم الله، والصبر على اتباع أمر الله، والصبر عند المصائب احتسابا لله. والقناعة في 3 أشياء: قلة الغذاء بعد وجوده، وقلة الغذاء بعد وجوده، وصيانة الفقر عند العدم، وقلة الأسباب، والسكون إلى أوقات الله عز وجل مع حلول الفاقة. وللقناعة أول وآخر، فأولها ترك الفضول مع وجود الاتساع، وآخرها وجود الغنى مع فقد الأسباب. ومنها هنا قال بعضهم القناعة أعلى من الرضا، وإنما أراد قناعة التمام، لأن الراضي لا يتعرض في المنع والعطاء، والقانع غني بربه لا يحب الزيادة معه من حظ هو له إلا منه له. والزهد في 3 أشياء لا يسمى زاهدا إلا بها: خلع الأيدي من الأملاك، ونزاهة النفس عن الحلال، والسهو عن الدنيا بكثرة الأوقات. ويكون الرجل متزاهدا ب3 أشياء: حمية النفس عند ترامي الإرادات، والهرب من مواطب الغنى، وأخذ المعلوم عند الحاجة. والأنس في 3 أشياء: أنس بالعلم والذكر في الخلوة، وأنس باليقين والمعرفة مع الخلوة، وأنس بالله عز وجل في كل حال. نظام المحبة ونفس التوكل ونفس التوكل روح اليقين. وقد ذكر عن أيوب السختياني والفضيل بن عياض رحمة الله عليهما أنهما كانا يقولان الرضا التوكل. فهذه شعب الصدق المأخوذة بأوصاف العلم. وكان سفيان الثوري رحمه الله تعالى يقول إذا كمل صدق الصادق لم يملك ما في يديه. Okay, stop there. It's quite a bit. So I read all of that because it's all related, but actually what he introduces here hasn't finished. It's all really interesting, but I'm not going to, I'll try not to over elaborate on this, but just try to keep it limited to what he is saying and just provide some points of clarification. So al-muhasibi says, and know, Allah have mercy on you, that truthfulness, so he obviously, from the explanation, he obviously doesn't mean by that just truthfulness of the tongue, but he means being true. Truthfulness as in to be being true or truthful in a broader sense, not just limited to truthful words. So truthfulness, or I'm not sure honesty will cut it, but you could perhaps use that word as well. So truthfulness and sincerity are the root, or are the roots of every state. So that's every spiritual state, every state that we experience that falls within what you might call a kind of, a spiritual state, right? States of the heart. So every state, the root of it is tied to truthfulness and sincerity. فَمِنَ الصِّدْقِ, because it is from truthfulness that patience, contentment, zuhud, or kind of this, the lack of interest in the dunya. Zuhud is the lack of interest in the dunya. Asceticism sometimes it's translated as. So it's lack of interest in the dunya. Rida, or pleasure, i.e. pleasure with Allah's decree, being satisfied with Allah's decree. And familiarity or friendship, i.e. familiarity and friendship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That these things all emanate from, or they all branch out from the root of truthfulness. So truthfulness is the root, and then all of these things, all of these internal states and meanings and qualities and attributes branch out from the root of being true. So again, just to reiterate, so those qualities are patience, contentment, asceticism, i.e. a disinterest in the dunya, pleasure with Allah's decree, or satisfaction with Allah's decree, and uns. And uns is to be literally, a helicopter literally just flew over me, and to be close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the sense to be familiar with him. So sort of like in friendship, right? Uns. I suppose another way to understand uns is from its opposite. Like sometimes they talk about the opposite of uns as being wahsha, and wahsha is to be not alienated, but to be disconnected, right? So to be to be, there's a word that's on the tip of my tongue, but I can't find it. I've used it before in this class, but I can't find it. Estranged. That's it. That's the word. So wahsha is to be estranged from someone. So when you're estranged from somebody, you no longer have their company. You no longer have the familiarity with them, that comfort with them, that gives you, that enables you to benefit from their company. So you kind of end up estranged, right? You'd no longer have their company. So that's what's meant by uns, right? The opposite of that is uns, i.e. familiarity, having a relationship whereby you can be in someone's company, you feel close to them, you feel connected to them. That is uns. Okay. Anyway, so those are the qualities that emanate out of or branch out of the root of sabr. وعن الإخلاص يتشعب اليقين والخوف والمحبة والإجلال والحياء والتعظيم. And it is from sincerity that the following attributes branch out: conviction, fear, love, ijlal, glorification, if you like, glorification, modesty, or a feeling of shame before another, a feeling of modesty and shame, shame, bashfulness, or shameful inhibition. There's no direct translation for that word. Haya, basically, you've heard the word haya before. So haya and veneration, right? Veneration, a complete acknowledgement and recognition of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's greatness, veneration. So all of these attributes branch out from ikhlas, from sincerity, i.e. from being able to, from doing things purely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's only when a person is like that that one can say that, they have all of those other things. Now, I don't know what Imam al-muhasibi means here. I don't know if from the wording, it seems to me like he's saying, if you're true, if you have truthfulness, if you have sidq, then all of those other things come from your sidq. And if you have ikhlas, then all of those other things come from your ikhlas. But I think there's a bit of a chicken and egg going on, right? In the sense that I don't, it can also be argued that, that conviction comes from, sincerity and so on. And it can also be argued that not necessarily, that a person can be convinced of Allah's existence, convinced of Allah's oneness, convinced of the truth of Islam, but they're not mukhlis, they're not sincere. Despite that, they allow other interests to motivate their actions. So therefore, it is only when a person engages in ikhlas, i.e. they work to make sure, they decide that everything I do is going to be purely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then they try to work on themselves to bring about a state of constant self-awareness when they do something, so that it's clear in their mind and in their consciousness that what they are doing is purely for Allah's sake and it isn't for anyone else. Right? This is purely motivated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If it's motivated by anything else, they address that pollution, they address that corruption, right? So ikhlas is when they are doing things purely, khalisan lillah, purely for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when Muhasibi seems to be saying that his wording is such that he's saying that if there is ikhlas, all of those other things emanate from it, right? Branch out from it, and therefore they are a product of ikhlas. That only makes sense if you think of ikhlas as a functional quality, as a quality that you enact with your will and your decision. Does that make sense? So you correct, every action is corrected and purified so that it is purely for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sake. And what he's saying is that from that comes conviction, from that comes fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from that comes the love of Allah, from that comes the glorification of Allah, from that comes modesty and shamefulness before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and from that comes true veneration of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, either as a consequence of it, or it is a consequence, or rather it is something granted to a person by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as a reward for making their actions sincere. And of course we know that from the Quran that ikhlas is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has demanded in the Quran, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا أُمِرُوا إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ مُخْلِصِينَ لَهُ الدِّينَ حُنَفَاءَ, that they have been commanded to worship, only to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, making their submission, their devotion to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only for him, mukhlisina lahuddin, dedicating it only to him, hunafa'a, away from all others, right? So I guess ikhlas is I've probably said this many times before, but ikhlas is a kind of weeding out all conflicts of interest and all corruption in motivation and drive. If we want to troubleshoot our ikhlas, right? How would we do it? How do you troubleshoot your ikhlas? How do you check it? And I think the way you check it is you ask yourself, what is driving me to do what I am doing? What drives me to do it? Right? What is it? Like, is there something that drives me to do this act that is polluting my sincerity, so that if that driver is missing, I wouldn't be doing it? I think this is the hardest question. This is the hardest question, because we may find many a times that there is something else driving us. Had that element been absent, had that driver, had that motivator, or had that conflicting interest been absent, then we may not be doing this good deed. We may not be giving this charity. We may not be attending salah in the masjid. We may not be doing that tilawa. We may not be doing this good deed. We may not be doing this bit of activism. We may not be, seeking this piece of knowledge, and so on and so forth. When is our action clean of all conflicts of interest, clean of all competing drivers? I'm not saying this is easy to do, and I'm not saying it's even like immediately possible to do. I'm saying this is an aspirational goal for every single Muslim, to try to clean out our actions by way of weeding out the conflicts of interest, weeding out the competing drivers, because they are, in the purest sense of ikhlas, these are corrupting aspects. These are things that are a corrupting influence upon our ikhlas, right? So for example, a person goes to the masjid 5 times a day, but when they troubleshoot their ikhlas, they find that there is something mixed with that action, with the intention for that action, that mixed with the driving force behind that action, that weakens the ikhlas, or brings the ikhlas into question. And I'll tell you a really, really powerful one for something like that is my social circle. Right? My social circle. Now, that's not a bad thing. We're told to surround ourselves with good friends, right? Because that would direct us towards good deeds. But we're talking about a purity of ikhlas. And purity of ikhlas is when even that something good, really, something that is good, is being looked at, and we're asking ourselves, how can I get to a point where I would go to the masjid for my 5 times salah, even if I had no social circle that went with me? right? Or even if even if there was no expectation from anybody for me to go. And of course, this is one of the reasons why many like pious people in the past used to separate themselves from people so that they would be and go to places where they would not be recognized. Nobody would know them. They would become anonymous completely so that they could clean out these weeds, because then there is no expectation from anyone. The expectation to be seen as pious, the expectation to be seen as knowledgeable, the expectation to be seen as practicing, the expectation to be seen as from a good family, the expectation to be seen as honorable, to be seen as respectful. All of those expectations and those conflicts of interest go away. Then they work on continuing to be pious and continuing to do all of those things so as to prove to themselves, so as to demonstrate practically that actually they are indeed driven by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not by all of these other corrupting influences upon their ikhlas. Does that make sense? I think that's a really, really important thing for myself anyway, at least for my own troubleshooting my own ikhlas. I think it's really important to break that down. So it can be difficult to actually word that clear. What I'm trying to do here is try to not make ikhlas just about intention, because sometimes I think that messes the concept up a little bit. Ikhlas isn't just about intention. That's why I kept using words like the driving force or the driver, the motivator. What is making that deed happen, right? Intention is somewhat different, right? So, takes a lot of, like, it does take a lot of kind of, there's a lot of overlap with intention. All right, but there's also a lot of confusion, because sometimes people they think of intention as a ritual act. I have to make intention when I pray because it's a fard. That's very different to the idea of sincerity, which may be absent in the moment that a person makes their intention for salah. But that would still be a valid intention as far as the rules of salah are concerned, and they would have fulfilled their fard, but they wouldn't be worshipping Allah, dedicating worship only to Him. Because behind what drives that person to pray is something else, not just Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Another piece of advice here is that one of my teachers used to say, if you think that you are being driven to do good deeds by something other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that there's something else involved, then don't stop the good deed. Address the intention or address the driving mechanism. I troubleshoot your ikhlas, but don't stop the good deed, right? Just work on the ikhlas. Do you understand? So that's also extremely important, right? To recognize that you're giving charity, but there may be that there's something going on there that pollutes your sincerity. So you target the sincerity, not the charity. You do something else and the sincerity might be a bit clouded, then you address the sincerity, you don't stop the action. That's a really, really important piece of advice, because often when this is talked about, this is another confusion, or this is another mistake that people make. They stop the act. You don't stop the act, you deal with the issue of sincerity, you deal with that inner problem. Okay. So there's a lot to get through, so let's move on. So he says, so those are all of those qualities branch out of ikhlas. And I was saying that there's a chicken and egg kind of scenario, and that it's as though he's saying, if you work on the ikhlas, then the conviction, the fear, the love, the glorification, the shame, and the veneration will come out of that ikhlas. And he says here, then he says, and every believer in all of these states, or all of these, if you like, these stations, these spiritual stations, right? We were to think of them as ranked stations, some high, some low. So every believer in all of these stations has a position. They have a place, meaning you belong somewhere. in those ranks, has a place by which, or has a, yeah, so has a station or has a place like a overbearing quality, right? That's what it means here. Mawtin, like he has a home, meaning there is a quality that they have that is strong in them by which they are known, right? His condition is known by it. For example, he may be called the one who has fear, khaif, but he has hope, meaning he's also a person who has hope in Allah's mercy. But generally, there is an overbearing aura of fear of Allah about him, and therefore he is known as the khaif. So out of all of these different states, spiritual states and degrees within those spiritual states, there is one that he is known by, and that is the fear, even though he does have hope. And there is another who is known to be the person of hope, even though he does have fear in him. And another is known as the one who is patient, who works to endure the struggle. But in him is also the quality of being content with Allah's decree, or being satisfied with Allah's decree. He has the quality of rida, satisfaction. There's obviously an interesting conversation here, like how is he contrasting sabr with satisfaction? It seems to me that he's understanding sabr as something that requires an effort, right? Sabr comes with great with great strength and will and determination, in the sense that a person is having to, like, their mind and their soul is screaming out to do something, and that it's as though they are pulling themselves back, they're holding themselves back, right? They, it's like, think of some of the context in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about sabr, right? So he talks about sabr in the context of vengeance in one place. He says, وَلَمَنْ صَبَرَ وَغَفَرَ إِنَّ ذَلِكَ لَمِنْ عَزْمِ الْأُمُورِ. Indeed, the one who is patient, who has sabr, and who forgives, إِنَّ ذَلِكَ لَمِنْ عَزْمِ الْأُمُورِ. That is from the matters of great resolve, right? Meaning that's taken, azm is willpower. Allah is saying that's one of the matters of great willpower and resolve, right? Because that's what it takes to retreat back from your legitimate right to avenge a wrong done to you. Because what is the context of this verse? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about وَلَمَنْ انْتَصَرَ بَعْدَ ظُلْمِهِ فَأُولَٰئِكَ مَا عَلَيْهِمْ مِنْ سَبِيلٍ. There is no blame against those who avenge after having been wronged. And it's a very natural, it's a very natural emotion and sentiment to want to take action against somebody who has wronged a person. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in recognition of that, says there's no blame against such a person, but the harder thing to do is to be patient and to forgive. And anyone who does that, that is a matter of true and firm willpower. So sabr takes this amazing effort, right? We were just talking today about a verse. I don't know if it's going to come to me now, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about, I think it was Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. This is somebody, a relative of his who he used to help. And that relative did something, and Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu promised that he would not help that person anymore, right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala admonishes him for that. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala admonishes him for that. And says, أَلَا تُحِبُّونَ أَن يَغْفِرَ اللَّهُ لَكُمْ? Right? That it is better for you to forgive that person and continue your charity. Do you not want Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive you? Sorry, the verse is just وَلَا يَأْتَلِ أُولُو الْفَضْلِ مِنْكُمْ. That's the verse. وَلَا يَأْتَلِ أُولُو الْفَضْلِ مِنْكُمْ وَالسَّعَةِ. Those who have been graced with bounty and plenty should not swear that they will no longer give to kinsmen, i.e. their relatives, the poor, those who emigrated in God's way. Let them pardon and forgive. Right? وَلْيَعْفُوا وَلْيَصْفَحُوا أَلَا تُحِبُّونَ أَن يَغْفِرَ اللَّهُ لَكُمْ. So here is an act of that involves patience, because it's hard. Right? It's hard to do that. You feel legitimately aggrieved and you think, I've been helping this person all this time, right? And now he goes and betrays me by going and doing something. And I think here it wasn't even personal. It was something that the person had done against Islam, I believe, if I can recall correctly. So therefore, it's like how and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala admonishes him and says, well, it is better for you to pardon and forgive. So similarly, sabr takes this effort, right? I'm laboring a little bit on this point, but sabr takes this effort in contrast, rida, being pleased with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's decree, is through patience, the practice of patience, and so on. It's to reach a state in which a person is pleased with whatever Allah decrees, even if it's bad. Like, they're almost indifferent to it. Rida is to be satisfied. Rida is satisfaction. They're not struggling with it, but rather they're satisfied. So, so it could be that a person is known as a sabir, known as a person of patience, but they have an element of satisfaction in them as well. And it's possible for that a person is overbearingly seen as and described as a person of love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But in them is also the attribute of refrain of haya, of shame, in the sense that, I suppose here what's being, again, another really complicated contrast. It seems to me that what he is doing here is he's contrasting being motivated to serve Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and obey him and worship him and fulfill his commands out of love for him, versus out of shame in his disobedience. So let's contrast it clearly, right? So one person has reached a maqam where they love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala so much that their dedication to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is an act of love. Another person recognizes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's glory and majesty and generosity and bounty, such that he or she finds it embarrassing to disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You see what I mean? Like, the different places, they're different qualities. And he's saying that sometimes a person is known for one, but they have the other as well, right? So this person is a muhib, is a person driven by love, but they also have the element of haya in them. And then he says, وَقُوَّةُ كُلِّ حَالٍ وَضَعْفُهُ بِحَسْبِ إِيمَانِ الْعَبْدِ وَمَعْرِفَتِهِ. The strength of each state and the weakness of it is according to the iman of the slave and the extent of his knowledge and recognition of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it all depends, right? It perhaps when in a lot of your reflection, you considered the love aspect and read about it and studied about it and so on, and that's what influences you, as opposed to the other. It could be the sabr element for you. And I would also say that it's also, to an extent, particularly in the earlier stages of a person's development, it is also temperament. It is also our disposition, right? A fiery person would be driven by sabr a lot more and for a lot longer than, say, satisfaction with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's decree in certain issues, and they would have to trample upon their ego quite significantly until they get to a point of complete satisfaction with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's decree. And I guess when I say a fiery person, what I mean is an emotional person. Probably retreat back a little bit and be even more general, then we're talking about an emotional person of high emotion. You know, sabr is probably their first battle. They have to have sabr to contain themselves constantly, and rida is something that they would have to work towards, right? Right, and then he says, وَلِكُلِّ أَصْلٍ مِّنْ هَذِهِ الْأَحْوَالِ ثَلَاثَةُ عَلَامَاتٍ يُعْرَفُ بِهَا الْحَالِ. Each one of these principles, or each one of these qualities, I'm going to say qualities here because it makes more sense. Each one of these qualities out of the ones mentioned, so truthfulness, patience, contentment, you know, these kind of things. So he's saying for each one of these, there are three things that can never be complete without the quality, right? So وَلِكُلِّ أَصْلٍ مِّنْ هَذِهِ الْأَحْوَالِ ثَلَاثَةُ عَلَامَاتٍ يُعْرَفُ بِهَا الْحَالِ. For each, sorry, let's just retranslate that because I moved between lines there. So he says for each one of these qualities, there are three signs by which the quality is known, by which the state is known. So we're talking about truthfulness, we're talking about contentment, we're talking about asceticism, we're talking about being pleased with Allah's decree, we're talking about familiarity and friendship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All of these, there are three, each one of them has three signs, you know, by which a person can know the existence of that state. And then he kind of explains it in an interesting way. He says, فَالصِّدْقُ فِي ثَلَاثِ أَشْيَاءَ لَا تَتِمُّ إِلَّا بِهِ. There are three, if you want to know about your truthfulness, then there are three things that require truthfulness such that those three things can never be complete without truthfulness. Meaning truthfulness is absolutely necessary in these three things. If truthfulness is absent, then these things are incomplete and corrupted. What are those three things? He says, صِدْقُ الْقَلْبِ بِالْإِيمَانِ تَحْقِيقًا. The realization of truthfulness of the heart when it comes to Iman. Realizing truthfulness of the heart when it comes to Iman is something in which truthfulness is absolutely a must, otherwise it is incomplete. And of course, Iman in which the truthfulness of the heart is absent is hypocrisy, right? So he's saying that absolutely this is where your sidq is really put to the sword, put to the test, right? You know, there is no Iman without sidq. And of course, Iman by definition is tasdiq. Tasdiq from the same root is an affirmation of Allah and His Messenger and Islam as true. And then he says, وَصِدْقُ النِّيَّةِ فِي الْأَعْمَالِ, and true intention or truthfulness of intention in actions, meaning, and this is pretty much what the hadith tells us, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ, actions are by their intentions, i.e. without it those actions are incomplete, i.e. they will not be rewarded, and at times where by law it is required, those actions are not valid. So if there is no intention for salah, there is no salah, and so on. And generally in our actions, if there is no intention, then the action receives no reward. So here you can see the absence of intention is immediately damaging to the act, to the deed, and therefore the intention is a must. The intention plays a pivotal role, right, in that act. And then he says, وَصِدْقُ اللَّفْظِ فِي الْكَلَامِ, and truthfulness of words in speech, meaning that when in your speech you are either truthful or you are not. You're either telling the truth or you are not. And over here, truthfulness is an absolute must. If there is no truthfulness in your speech, then your speech is false speech. It is falsehood. It is a lie, right? And so on. So therefore, these are three things in which, truthfulness is an absolute requirement, and therefore they are kind of, this truthfulness is truly manifested in them, and therefore they are signs of truthfulness. Okay, inshallah. Okay, then he says, so he moves from truthfulness to patience, and he says, and patience there are three things. So I'm going to translate it according to how he wants to put it, right? So there are three things that are not complete without patience. So those three things, therefore, are become a sign of the manifestation of patience. Number one, patience from the prohibitions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, i.e. abstention. So over here, patience means abstaining, staying away, refraining from. So patience from the maharim of Allah, those things that Allah has made haram. Patience upon following the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in the first one, patience meant abstention. Over here, patience means steadfastness, staying steadfast upon the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as-sabru inda al-masa'ibi ihtisaban lillah is the last one, which is patience over difficulties and calamities, expecting reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Not because you have to, not because there's no other way, but because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promises reward to the patient, right? So these are the three things that are a measure of a person's patience. So for example, you definitely, so they're supposed to be signs, right? They're supposed to be signs of the quality. So a person who, the measure, the extent of a person's abstinence from sin is an evidence of that much patience, right? You have patience to the measure of the sins that you refrain from. There is evidence of your patience. The extent to which you are able to steadfastly stay upon the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and upon following them, there is a measure and a proof and an evidence of your patience. And the extent to which you are able to have patience in the face of calamities and difficulties and illness and and suffering and grief and loss and poverty and so on, is a measure, is an actual, and for the sake of Allah, ihtisaban lillah, for the sake of Allah, i.e. expecting reward of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is a measure of your patience, right? It's like that's your thermometer. Okay. وَالْقَنَاعَةُ فِي ثَلَاثَةِ أَشْيَاءَ. And then in the same, following the same vein, he's saying that, contentment is manifested in three things. Qana'ah here isn't being pleased with Allah's destiny. It's different, right? Qana'ah is a different word. The other one, the other one, which I kept trying to remember to translate as satisfaction and a pleasure with Allah's decree, is rida. So qana'ah, rida, two definitely overlapping things, but different. It's a bit like intention and sincerity. So he's saying qana'ah is manifested in three things, right? A person's contentment is manifested in three things, right? I mean, these three things are a sign, they are a measure of a person's contentment. Illatul ghidha'i ba'da wujudihi. He says it's to reduce the intake of food, reduce the intake of food despite its availability. So our ability to to be measured and to be conservative in our consumption. I'm going to use the word consumption here because I think consumption is a really important word. But it is our ability to basically be measured and conservative in our consumption, despite the availability or access to the thing that we are consuming. Obviously, he's talking about food, but you can broaden that. وَصِيَانَةُ الْفَقْرِ عِنْدَ الْعَدَمِ, the protection of one's poverty when there is none, right? Meaning that when a person does not have, i.e., they don't have wealth. A person is poor, and he's talking about protection of one's poverty at a time when a person is deprived and has less means. قِلَّةِ الْأَسْبَابِ, has less means. So you're deprived of wealth, you have less means. At that time, you protect your poverty. How do you do that? What in God's name does that mean, right? So what he means here by protection of poverty is that you protect your poverty from the things that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam has taught the poor not to do. For example, the Prophet alaihi wasallam generally has discouraged people to spread their hand out to others and beg. He's told people to not rely on what other people have, but to rely on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to rely on and to work yourself, right? And to eat from the sweat of your brow. And the Prophet ﷺ has taught that true wealthiness, true richness is that which is situated in the heart. And the Prophet ﷺ has taught that don't even ask somebody to pick up that he taught some of the Sahaba who were described as people who wouldn't even ask another person to pick up their horsewhip for them. They would get down and pick it up themselves. They were they lived so independently of others that they wouldn't even ask a favor as little as that. The Prophet taught this level of independence, right? So he's saying, and the Quran describes the Sahaba, the Muhajirun in particular, as يَحْسَبُهُمُ الْجَاهِلُ أَغْنِيَاءَ مِنَ التَّعَفُّفِ. That Allah, the general gist of it is, seek out these people to give them your charity, because the person who is ignorant of their situation will think they are rich because of how independent they are and how free they are from asking others for help. This is the siyana, right? A simple way to put that is they express an attitude of contentment and satisfaction and wealthiness. When you look at them, you'd think they're comfortable, they're wealthy. Actually, they're struggling. But it is the way in which they carry themselves, right? And this is what he means. So he's saying contentment is, the first part of contentment is, the first quality is to consume less even when you have. But when you don't have, you protect your poverty by giving off an air of satisfaction with what you have, so that even though you don't have, people don't realize it, right? Because you're content. And then finally, والسكون إلى أوقات الله عز وجل مع حلول الفاقة, and seeking tranquility in times with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I mean, he says seeking comfort in the times of Allah, إلى أوقات الله. And what I've understood that to mean is times with Allah, the times in which a person is to draw near to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to seek tranquility in those times when famine and poverty and hunger strikes. By that we don't mean when you're hungry, but when a person is going hungry due to poverty, find tranquility, find peace in the times with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ila awqatillahi azza wa jal. I suppose another meaning could be here that finding tranquility in recognizing that times change, that times evolve. That if you're having a bad period of poverty and struggle, then times evolve. Okay, these are the two meanings that are coming to my mind over here, because he doesn't explain this, but it seems to me that either one of these or both of these can be valid. And then he says, وَلِلْقَنَاعَةِ أَوَّلٌ وَآخِرٌ. And he continues on about qana'a, about contentment. And he says, contentment has a beginning and an end. The beginning of contentment, I guess the first stage, if you like, the early stages of developing this quality in ourselves. He says the first stage of it is tarkul fuduli ma'a wujud al-ittisa', is to give up excess, is to give up abandoning excess, even though a person has ittisa'. Ittisa' is abundance, flexibility, capacity, capability, right? Ittisa' is you have the space, you have the money, you have the savings, you have the abundance, right? You know, to engage in some fudul, to engage in some excess, a few extra holidays, a bit of luxuriating, etc., etc. He's saying the first part of contentment, right, of contentment is even when you are like that, avoid excess. This is very, this is actually a really good point to stress and to reflect on, because the Sahaba around the Prophet ﷺ, even though they were wealthy, this is a quality they did exhibit, right? So even though you have, even what you have, you avoid excess, even though you know you could be excessive, right? وآخرها, and he says the end of it, the final kind of destination of it, if you like, is وجود الغنى مع فقد الأسباب. Is for there to be wealth, or this aura of independence and wealthiness, even though a person is deprived of means, i.e. there's poverty, there's deprivation of means, there's constriction, you know, and so on and so forth. In spite of that, a person has wealth, i.e. they have wealth, they have a wealthy heart, they have a rich heart, right? So he's saying that is the end. That is meaning that's, so one would therefore conclude that that is a harder station to achieve, right? It is easier for a person who has, you know, where your next meal is going to come from, you know, where, you know that you're okay for that, you've got enough money, like for your children's education, etc., etc. In that scenario, it's easy to choose to live a simpler life, to live a moderate life. You know, it doesn't have to be a life that mimics poverty. It can be moderacy. It can be a life that isn't extravagant and excessive. But it is easier to choose to not be excessive and to live a modest life when you have plenty, than it is to remain independent and remain limited to one's capacity when you have very little of it, right? Without reaching out to others for help and so on and so forth, because you're satisfied inside, or to just remain content with what one has, right? Because they're satisfied inside, they're happy inside, they're wealthy inside. That's a much harder thing to do. So the first step is the former, and this one is the last step. That is the harder thing to achieve. ومن هنا قال بعضهم, it is because of this that some scholars say that qana'a, that contentment is greater than, is higher than satisfaction with Allah's decree. That contentment is higher than satisfaction with Allah's decree. But Imam al-Muhasibi clarifies, he says, however, what they mean is perfect. What they mean is perfect contentment, because the one who is satisfied with Allah's decree does not complain in when means are restricted from him, as well as when they are given to him. In both of those situations, they have no complaints. They are equal. That is the person who is pleased and satisfied with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's decree. And then he talks about the content person. The content person is ghaniyun bi rabbihi. The content person is simply wealthy by the gift of his Lord. Allah subhanahu, he's just Like for him, it's like Allah is my wealth. I have Allah, I don't need anybody else. Right? So that's the slight contrast. And then he tries to further clarify using a line that's really tough to understand. He says something along the lines of لا يحب الزيادة معه. He doesn't want anything more when he has Allah with him. Right? من حظ هو له. He doesn't want anything more when he has Allah with him than the portion that he already has, unless it comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Meaning, I'm happy with whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given me. I don't want more. I don't want more unless I'm satisfied that that more is coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Then I don't reject Allah's bounty. As opposed to the Radi, the one who is pleased with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's decree, he is happy in all circumstances, and therefore there is a greater chance that that person may have wealth. This is my understanding of it. That may have wealth and is satisfied with that, but would be just as satisfied if they didn't have it. Whereas the Qani' doesn't seek wealth at all, right? Unless it was something that he was satisfied was from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and not taking it would be to reject it. Okay, it's difficult kind of sometimes difficult spiritual discussions. وَزُهْدُ فِي ثَلَاثِ أَشْيَاء. I'm a little bit out of time, but I want to hold on. I wanted to discuss one more attribute. So if you guys don't mind, can I carry on a bit longer? I'll have to carry on for a few more minutes, inshallah, to finish these bits off. Is that okay? Okay, so he says, I'm assuming you guys are okay with it. All right, just give me a second, inshallah. So then he says, and asceticism, or being disinterested in the dunya, also has three signs. That's what we're talking about, right? It has three signs. A person cannot be described as an ascetic or as a zahid except if they have these signs. Number one, khal'ul aydi min al-amlak. So this is an even tougher station, I think. Khal'ul aydi min al-amlak. Their hands are empty of possessions. Wa nazahatun nafsi anil halal. And they purify their self from the halal, meaning not only do they refrain from the haram, but even some halal things they go without. They go without some halal things. وَالسَّهْوَ عَنِ الدُّنْيَا بِكَثْرَةِ الْأَوْقَاتِ. And they are heedless of the dunya with the abundance of times. And I think what he means by that is no matter what's happening in the world, right? Regardless of what times are bringing, what the vicissitudes, I think is the word, of time. Regardless of that, they're kind of like, they're oblivious. They have a degree of obliviousness to the dunya. Those are the zuhad. Abdullah ibn Mubarak rahmatullahi alayhi has a famous book on zuhud. He says, هو الذي إن أصاب الدنيا لم يفرح وإن فاتته لم يحزن. Zahid is a person who, if they happen to have the dunya, they're not pleased with it. They're not happy with it. Right? They don't rejoice at worldly possessions. And if they don't have it, right? If the dunya misses them, they don't grieve. They just don't care about the dunya. That's it, right? They just don't care about the dunya. This is what al-muhasibi is saying. No matter what happens, no matter what goes on, they just don't care about the dunya. All right. So, and then he continues, وَيَكُونُ الرَّجُلُ مُتَزَاهِدًا بِثَلَاثَةٍ أُخَرَ. And a person becomes, as he says, those three qualities are signs of zuhud, which means the qualities are going to be in different measures in a person. So those were descriptions of qualities, right? Of states. So you or I, we'll have different measures of it. Some people will be like that, some people will be down there, and so on. Then he says, a person becomes a zahid because of three things. حمية النفس عند ترامي الإرادات. Right? حمية النفس, protecting the soul, protecting the self, عند ترامي الإرادات. Right? When a person's intentions and a person's decisions and intentions, are conflicting and jostling with one another. So you've got all these different decisions to consider, different things that in front of you. At that time, a person is protective of their nafs, i.e. they take decisions based on their spiritual interests, right? They're protective of their soul, of their nafs. The second is al-harabu min mawatin al-ghina. They tend to flee from places of wealth and wealthiness, right? They don't like it. It's a place that makes them, those are situations and places and circumstances and people that make them uncomfortable, that make that they don't like, and so they flee from it. Al-harabu min mawatin al-ghina wa akhdhu al-ma'lumi 'inda al-haja. When there is a need, they take what is known. أخذ المعلوم عند الحاجة. When there is a need. So now there is hunger, you have to eat. You have to feed your family, so you have to earn. What do they do at this time? They take what is known. And I think here he means things like what is known to be halal. They are really, really scrupulous. What is known to be halal, what is known to be pure, what is known to be wholesome, what is known to have no corruption in it, what is known to have no falsehood and lying and deceit and things like that in it. What is known to have no dodgy ingredients in it. All of those possibilities, basically. They tend to stick to what is known. I know this is 100%. Okay, fine. This is good enough for me. I know this is 100% free of deceit. This is good enough for me. I'm not sure. A zahid sets it aside. All right? It could be. There's a difference of opinion. A zahid sets it aside. All right? And then he says, وَالْأُنْسُ فِي ثَلَاثِ أَشْيَاء, and familiarity and friendship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the opposite of estrangement. Remember what I said? That state is manifested in three things. أُنْسٌ بِالْعِلْمِ. This is quite straightforward. That how? Allah, we don't have a physical proximity to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So how do we attain familiarity with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So he says, the first one is with knowledge. A person ignorant of Allah cannot have any uns, cannot have any familiarity with it. How can you have familiarity if you're ignorant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and carry on as though Allah is my friend and Allah is this and Allah will take care of me? And those are just words, right? It requires knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have familiarity with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَالذِّكْرِ فِي الْخَلْوَةِ. It takes remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in solitude, in a state where one is alone, to have familiarity with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So knowledge, dhikr in solitude, wa unsun bil yaqini wal ma'rifati ma'al khalwa. That, and also this friendship and proximity with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes with conviction and recognition. Conviction and recognition of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What you know of Allah, you know with certainty, right? So therefore you recognize Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with this certainty, and that too in khalwa, in solitude. Why? Because I can give you this talk and really eloquently demonstrate a profound knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It doesn't count for anything. It just means I'm articulate. Right? So therefore he adds that clause that it's about connecting with your conviction and with your ma'rifah, with your knowledge and gnosis of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when you're alone. In that state of, if you don't feel it in your solitude, then your big talk of it, like me, I'm doing here, it's just rhetoric. Right? It's just rhetoric. It's just, it's just, you have the gift of the gab, right? You know how to talk up a good game, but that's about it. And then finally, وَأُنْسٌ بِاللَّهِ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ فِي كُلِّ حَالٍ, and familiarity with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in every situation. That's, a difficult one, right? But again, he's talking about the attribute, not the person. So the attribute, therefore, exists in each person to different measures, right? So, you know, there is that sense of Allah is there for me. Allah, you know, I trust in Allah. Allah will protect me. Whatever Allah does is good. These are some of the sentiments that come out of uns, right? That comes out of uns, or comes out of that familiarity with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And finally, pleasure with Allah's decree is he says pleasure with Allah's decree. He doesn't actually talk about it in terms of signs, but he says pleasure with Allah's decree is the thing that that regulates a person's love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is the soul of tawakkul. It is the soul of reliance upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is the soul. He uses nafs for one and ruh for the other. I'm just going to translate both of them as soul, right? It is the soul of conviction. وَقَدْ ذُكِرَ عَنْ أَيُّوبَ السِّخْتِيَانِي. It is said of Ayyub al-Sikhtiyani, famous scholar and ascetic, and al-Fudayl ibn al-Ayyad, the same, rahmatullahi alayhima, that they used to say, pleasure in Allah's decree is tawakkul. Because if you think about tawakkul, right, tawakkul is acceptance of all eventualities. You trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala such that you accept all eventualities. That's tawakkul, and therefore tawakkul is pleasure or satisfaction with Allah's decree, one way or the other, right? One way or the other. This is why, you know, like in COVID, so many ulama were explaining that taking precautions in COVID is not against tawakkul, because tawakkul is the acceptance of all eventualities. So it is also the acceptance of the fact that the pandemic is here and I must do as per the dictates of the pandemic, right? It is, Umar radiallahu anhu said, it is fleeing from Allah's decree to Allah's decree. The acceptance that I've got to move, and I've got to move the pieces, right? However, wherever I end up, I'm okay with, because it is all part of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's decree either way, right? And therefore I am satisfied with it, and that is tawakkul. Okay, inshallah. That's it. I'm stopping there. I'm glad I got through to that point, inshallah. All right. A couple of questions. So there's a comment here and there's a question. How can we help the younger generation with their patience when it comes to abstinence of sin, especially in today's society where almost everything is acceptable? Should the basis be to build a love for God first, or is this something that develops with age? No, because we don't speak of these things in terms of alternatives. These things, it's not a one or the other. What Imam al-muhasibi is talking about is how people's dispositions are different, and a person has a greater outpouring of one, and therefore they are known for that. That seems to be their dominant disposition. However, it doesn't mean that they're absent of the other, which kind of answers your question, which is we have to work on both of them, right? We have to work on both of them. The disparity in people, the difference in people is going to depend on their disposition, but our effort has to be for both. Does that make sense? The result, you may have absolute 50% effort, right? But a person's disposition will produce a result that will show that one quality is dominant in that person than the other. All right. I grew up in the generation where instilling fear of God was the predominant approach by parents and imams. Yeah, that's different. So you're talking about pedagogy, right? We're talking about how we do it, how we instill, how we connect people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I would say without a shadow of a doubt, if you look at the example of the Prophet ﷺ, how we connect, methodology comes from the Prophet. How we connect people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has to be one that is positive, that is based upon predominantly upon the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, upon hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but with the fear element being brought in as per necessity, it's one that is not neglected. So the fear element isn't neglected, the punishment element isn't neglected. And this is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if you notice throughout the Quran, if you look at divine pedagogy, the way Allah does it, subhanahu wa ta'ala, He will often mention the reward first and but bring in punishment with it. Almost in, there's a kind of constant juxtaposition. They're always together. They're always together, right? So therefore, it is really bad if the punishment is only mentioned, or the harsh side of it is only mentioned, and there's no mention of reward. There's no mention of love of Allah. There's no mention of the mercy of Allah. There's no mention of the ni'am of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There is only Allah will punish you, and etc. etc. There is only the fear element. That's problematic. Ideally, do both, and if you must choose one, it is better to choose Allah's mercy than and forgiveness and to give people hope than punishment. The punishment element will always be there, and it will always instill fear. Yes, sometimes interventionally, I would say with some people, you may have to bring the other forward, bring the punishment element forward, but that would be done interventionally, right? And remember, the primary pedagogy in these things is the Prophet's pedagogy. The Quran is the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that speaks with a kind of authority that was utilized by the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. It's like the textbook the Prophet used to teach, but the method of teaching it comes from the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. He is the teacher. إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ مُعَلِّمًا إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ لِأُتَمِّمَ مَكَارِمَ الْأَخْلَاقِ. I was taught sent as a teacher. I was taught to perfect the noble attributes or noble characteristics. The Prophet ﷺ was told, we have revealed the reminder to you لِتُبَيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ مَا نُزِلَ, so that you may explain to people what was revealed to them. So the Prophet ﷺ's pedagogy, the Prophet's methodology is key in all of this, and that was a methodology certainly that was filled of that was full of beauty and love and compassion and mercy, as well as warnings and so on and so forth where necessary. But the Prophet ﷺ used to speak of it in such a way. When he used to speak of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's punishment, when he used to speak of his fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he used to speak of it as something that should be feared because of us, not because of Allah. It's because we haven't done enough, because we are remiss, because we should worry about our actions, because compared to what Allah has given us, compared to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has been Allah's default generosity upon mankind, given that He gave us life without ever earning it. He gave us limbs without ever earning it. He gave us status without ever earning it. He made us the greatest of His creation without ever earning it. Imagine being an ant. Imagine being an ant. My sister's garden, visited her recently, right? I have to tell this story. I'm going to maybe make this clip and send it to her. Has an ant infestation, right? Like there's like hundreds and hundreds of them walking around, right? How it's happened, but it's happened, right? She has an ant infestation. And that day, I remember looking at this, right? That day, everybody's obsession was with killing ants, right? Everyone's obsession was with killing ants. They had the sprays, and they were going around spraying them, right? And I was sitting there thinking, like, this is an act of genocide. All right, that's what's happening. Imagine being that guy. Okay, He didn't. He made you a human being, right? He made you a human being. So the point is that when we consider all of these things and then consider the sin of man, right? That instilled fear. And the Prophet ﷺ used to feel that fear himself, even though technically speaking, all of his past and future sins are forgiven. So therefore, it kind of logically, it doesn't make sense but it was like the fear is a spiritual state, right? That comes from a kind of like, I'm not doing enough. And what if I'm made accountable for that? Even though all of his past and future sins were forgiven. And if you now think, that's the Prophet ﷺ, and that's the example he left for us. Now, if we think about ourselves, right, it's a fear that drives us to good action. It is not a paralyzing fear. It's important to recognize what the nature of that fear as well. That's really, really important. Okay, that's it. Yeah, poor ants. It's proper, like everybody was going around kind of spraying, killing ants. And I was thinking to myself, those are living creatures, but look at that. They've become a pest. It's permissible for them to be killed, right? In that situation. But look at that. It's just complete and utter impunity. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that's how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has raised man. Complete power over Allah's creation. Complete power. Right? But man doesn't recognize that Allah has complete power over him. That's the bit. That's it. That should inspire that fear. Right? One more question then. So I meet different Muslims who believe their way is the only way. Is there ikhtilaf on the mustache? Oh, okay. Is there ikhtilaf on the mustache? Can you kindly state what are they? So the Prophet ﷺ said, trim the mustache or clip the ends. Trim it or clip the ends. That's it. I don't understand why there should be an ikhtilaf. Doesn't matter. You trim it, clip the ends. Ulama say that it is makruh for it to come over your lips. Right? Yeah, and the more important, the more disagreed upon and significant issue happens to be the beard. And the thing is, both were discussed in the same hadith. All right. But the Prophet ﷺ mentions two things about the mustache. Two things. One, trim the edges or trim it down. One or the other. So I would say, when you deal with, I'm more kind of troubled by the first bit of your question, not because you're asking it, but because this is a manifestation in our community. Meeting different Muslims who believe their way is the only way. And all I would say to all of you is, if you meet people like that, just ask yourself this one, ignore them, first of all, and ask yourself this one question on a matter of disagreement. Right? Number one, what is the best thing for me to do? So I would say, when it comes to matters of worship, follow a madhab. Outside of worship, try to do the best you can, try to be as prudent as you can and as cautious as you can, and try to follow the sunnah to the best of your ability. Not all issues are straightforward. Like this mustache issue, for me, is straightforward. Trim it, trim the edges, you're okay, finish, end of story. There's no issue beyond that. Unless you want to keep a mustache over your lips. You want to like cover your bottom lip with your mustache. You want some silly challenge. You want to do a handlebar mustache. Stuff like that. Obviously, different ulama are going to say different things because this wasn't even an issue. We've made it an issue because fashion nowadays is stupid. But generally, if it's just a question of what is the sunnah, really the question here is, what is the sunnah? And the sunnah is trim the edges, trim it down. That's it. As long as you do that, you conform to the sunnah. Anyway, you've already thanked me. So Jazakumullahu khairan. Barakallahu feek. And we'll end it there. I've taken loads of extra time today, inshallah. May Allah bless you all. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us tawfiq, inshallah, to practice all of this. And I'll see you and catch you all Monday again. Yeah. No, this point about some tabligh is if you're gonna go, you can go, inshallah. Just continue. The brother's still asking questions. Some tell me to shave it. You don't want to. The Prophet ﷺ clearly in a hadith mentions shaving as an option and trimming the edges as an option. Right? Ihfa and qas. Qas is to trim the edges. Ihfa is to trim it down. Both are an option, right? Do you remember when mine used to be shaved down, right? And then somebody decided to tell me to keep it, and I've kept it. All right, but the point is, they're both, they're both part of the sunnah. This is why do you think, ulama and so many people generally have a mustache, right? But but if you look at the Muslim mustache, if there's such a thing, you'll always see that it is trimmed at the edges, because that's what the hadith says. All right, from the woods. Sorry, that's what your name is in the comments. So anyway, assalamu alaikum everyone. Subhanallah, alhamdulillah, subhanakallah, alhamdulillah, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Sallallahu ta'ala wa sallam ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in.